Let's come to our second story, ladies and gentlemen, and that concerns the Ukraine conflict. Today is the 84th day of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. A lot has happened, a lot of sides have been taken, and of course, NATO is playing an important role in all of this, and other countries are joining NATO now. Where is all of this leading, whether economically, politically, or otherwise? More in the following report, then we'll return with our guest.
The Russia-Ukraine conflict is sending ripple effects across the world owing to complex interdependence of the world economic order. The 11th week of the Russian invasion of Ukraine saw Kiev's forces mount a counter-offensive. Ukrainian troops have recaptured towns to the north and east of the country's second city, Kharkiv, in eastern Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin stated that the West had triggered a global economic crisis and a wave of ruinous inflation by imposing on Russia the most severe sanctions in recent history over the conflict in Ukraine. Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine on 24th of February in a special military operation, prompting the United States and its allies to impose sweeping sanctions on Russia and the Russian elite, measures termed by Kremlin as a declaration of an economic war. The United Nations Human Rights Council has passed a resolution by a strong majority setting up an investigation into allegations of rights abuses by Russian troops in parts of Ukraine formerly under their control. According to United Nations Refugee Agency, more than 6 million refugees have fled Ukraine since Russia's invasion began on 24th of February. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has stated that Russia is the most direct threat to the international order. In order to avoid massive disruption of global economy, famine, destabilization, and humanitarian crisis, dialogue and diplomacy must be accorded primacy.
Dr. Usman Chohan, political economist, joins us online. Dr. Chohan, thank you very much to have joined us. It's always a pleasure to have you in our show. Dr. Chohan, let's talk economy first of all. Wheat, a lot of that is stuck in Ukraine as we speak. A lot of countries are not being supplied the necessary wheat. Then if we look at this situation economically, Europe will be committing economic suicide by seeking to phase out Russian energy supplies. This is what Vladimir Putin says, and there are so many other things that we'll discuss after that. But what do you foresee as far as the wheat crisis is concerned, and B, what Vladimir Putin has just said as far as economic suicide is concerned by Europe?
Yes, I think that the wheat concern is a significant one. I would say oil is the biggest thing, and then second is wheat. Especially for developing countries, wheat importation is a very important factor because both countries, Ukraine and Russia, were very significant suppliers of wheat to the world markets. So for developing countries that do not produce it but do consume it, such as Egypt, for example, or Bangladesh, it is a very scary scenario. Egypt, for example, is now considering buying wheat from Pakistan, as well as from other countries that produce wheat. So everybody is trying to find alternate things for food security, and they're having a tough time bidding for it in the international markets because not all producers want to sell anything. They also have to consider local prices and keeping the supply consistent domestically. In Pakistan, for example, we have to cater to our domestic needs before we're ready to export it.
Of course.
So the concern is therefore that there won't be enough supply on the world markets, and there are significant developing countries, well, significant in population, such as Bangladesh and Egypt, which are going to have a very hard time. And the Ukrainian foreign minister has said that he does take it seriously, the responsibility that Ukraine has to address this, but given the conditions, how are they to be able to do it? So, for example, the port of Odessa, which is the critical supply line, to get them onto the ships to the world markets, there's about 25 million tons of wheat estimated. 25 million tons of wheat at the port that cannot be delivered anywhere. And from what we are observing, Odessa may be a battleground. God forbid, I hope things resolve quickly and peacefully. But if Odessa becomes a battleground, what will happen to that wheat that is waiting at the port? So these are the concerns with wheat. And as for your second point about economic suicide, there is a validity to the point that there was for a long time, let's say the last 2.5 decades, an interdependency among Western Europe and Russia created through mutual investment, which included energy supplies from the Russian export side, and that is in a big jeopardy. Finding alternate sources in the short and medium term is very difficult for any country, alternate routes for the pipelines that have been invested in over time. So the price of commodities overall is severely impacted by this. So the consideration of a suicide, at least in the short term and medium term, is a scary one.
All right. Dr. Chohan, let's also talk about global food security. And we also know that Anthony Blinken is attending a meeting along with senior officials to discuss global food security. And this is, of course, under the auspices of the United Nations. Do you feel some concrete decisions will come out of it? Do you feel the dependence that a lot of countries, as you just said, in the West, in the European Union, have as far as food is concerned, as far as oil and energy and gas are concerned? Could the alternate solutions be found? I understand, as you've also said, that short and medium term solutions might work, but they are not solutions that will be tangible. So, of course, long-term solutions, how long will it take for countries in the West to find durable solutions?
You're asking an excellent question by focusing on the duration of the question at hand. And the duration can be adjusted based on how quickly things are resolved amicably and peacefully, hopefully. So having a summit on this is good because it signals that it's a priority point, and most countries are sending important delegations to this summit, so they're emphasizing the impact of it. But in terms of actions on the ground, in terms of addressing the world supply, whether it is for the consumables such as wheat that we eat, but also consumables such as petroleum in our cars and whatnot, addressing the short term, not everybody is on board. There isn't an international consensus, and ideally a conference like this would be the forum to have greater consensus, but it isn't clear to me that all countries are on the same page. You basically have a lot of bystanders, people who are in fact benefiting from a higher oil price. Oil exporting countries, for example, they are not interested in lowering the price. In fact, given that the deficit was created in COVID in terms of the oil price sinking so much, they're certainly making it back now. And so I don't observe anybody, oil producing OPEC or OPEC plus, interested in adjusting oil prices. So food prices, oil prices, and the general elements of core inflation are not being addressed in a uniform fashion, but that is because global politics right now is particularly charged, and not everybody is eager to take sides, and some people actually benefit from such chaos and violence.
Now, speaking of benefiting from this chaos and violence, of course, militarily, a lot of countries are benefiting from it by supplying weaponry to not only Ukraine, but also the adjoining states. But at the same time, let's talk about economy and food security now, and also economic assistance. The US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says during a speech in Brussels that the country, that is Ukraine, needs large-scale economic assistance. Do you feel at the same time that Russia needs assistance as well, or do you feel that it can sustain for a certain amount of months or some time the effects of this crisis that is engulfing the region?
This is a very interesting and very complicated question, because what was assumed about Russia's ability to withstand going into the conflict, so in February, mid to late February, was that they had $600 billion worth of reserves, diversified, not just in dollars. They had gold, they had yuan, they had euro, they had so much. So it was quite a war chest going into it. But given the architecture of sanctions that was applied, at least half of that was made unavailable to them. And so the Russian central bank had to take interesting policy measures. For example, it immediately hiked the interest rate to 20% and then stopped people from dealing in the ruble into foreign currencies. And other measures were taken, realizing that not all of the war chest of 600 billion would be available. As far as Ukraine goes, the claim by Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, that Ukraine needs assistance is correct, because the World Bank now estimates that the Ukrainian economy is going to shrink by 45%. So it will be half the size of what it was prior to the conflict. That is catastrophic. And obviously it's catastrophic. You see the images of their cities being leveled and destroyed and people fleeing and whatnot. So, but this has ripple effects for all of us. For example, in Poland, the capital, Warsaw, grew by 17% in terms of, so it reminds me of the influx of refugees in Pakistan back in the day from Afghanistan. So these sorts of ripple effects come out, and that is why Pakistan has behaved responsibly as a caring and responsible nation, arguing for a peaceful resolution of this conflict with the greater world interest in mind. We should always be advocating for responsible peace in the world.
True. You talk of responsible peace, you also talk of ripple effects. Pakistan has seen that with the Afghan influx of migrants. We are also now seeing in the European countries the influx of migrants from Ukraine. How long will the European Union sustain the influx of migrants and the effects of the crisis in Ukraine?
A very interesting question, because it is difficult to speak at the EU level, since all the member countries don't seem to be on the same page. Although the overall tendency is to be sympathetic towards the plight of Ukrainians, which is very reasonable given their suffering, but not all countries are on the same page. So, for example, the immediate neighbors, such as Poland, they have invested a lot and expanded their budget for accommodating refugees massively, in a way that Pakistan also did back in the day. And Germany and other countries sympathetic towards the plight are also advocating for a push. And as far as sustaining it, it seems that they have the capacity to, at least until the medium term, do it. For countries immediately close like Poland, they may even want to invest for the long run, which is saying that if Ukrainians don't go back, they may simply naturalize them in the long run. It seems to be the case. But for countries that have also a strong interest in maintaining close ties to Russia, perhaps Serbia or countries like that, they are they're not part of the EU. Serbia is not part of the EU, but still they're saying that there should be a bit of balance, not just all pro-Ukraine. Bulgaria, as a EU member, has a slightly different stance. Turkey, as a NATO member, has a slightly different stance on things. So it is difficult to speak with unanimity, but the tendency of the EU is to help out as much as possible, given what is at stake for the EU as a whole.
Now, we were talking about food in the beginning. Let's also talk about fast food and McDonald's that is closing down in Russia after 30 years. A lot of Russians lined up to get their last burgers and fries before the chain closes down. Do you feel that is going to have some kind of an effect, closing down of such chains for the US and your European Union, and also for Russia?
Yes, Russia was a fairly large market for many multinationals. I'm speaking of hundreds of multinationals, but it wasn't so large for any of them that it would immediately sink their income statements. So the way it worked is you can look at all of the sectors, from banking, such as JP Morgan, all the way to the fast-moving consumer goods, retail, all the way down to the discretionary, such as McDonald's, and they all, based on the moral leanings or the corporate board leanings that it pushed them to do that, they withdrew and they just simply wrote it off. As far as their effect of it, many of them have actually used it as a pretense to justify any other losses. For example, inflation in general being high, not just because of this conflict, but for example, supply chains being clumsy or fragile around the world. They're using this as a write-off, and then they'll move on. And sometimes companies that invest in emerging markets simply have to be prepared for this sort of thing. But I believe that this was a particularly severe and unseen thing. And so companies just simply have to write it off, the multinationals, and move on. And as far as the Russian domestic market, it's actually surprising that many of the things that Russian consumers would have purchased from such multinationals, let's say, soft drinks, burgers, etc., they are Russian equivalent brands, and their logos are a bit uncannily similar to the multinationals, and they seem to be surviving happily on the knockoffs, let's say.
All right. Let's talk of energy as well. Now, the European Commission is apparently expected to lay down a plan on how to wean the region of Russian hydrocarbons by the year 2027. Will that happen eventually by 2027? Do you expect it to happen in the way it is predicted?
This is a difficult question, because the transition to renewables post-COVID actually stuttered a little bit, because the energy costs were going high, supply chains were confused around the world. So there is a robust and solid basis for moving to renewables in general everywhere, including here in Pakistan. But the scale at which it was being done appeared to be given the shock of COVID and post-COVID, a little bit too ambitious because there is still a dependency on non-renewable resources, coal, oil, etc. Now there is also a political motivation for a very significant market, EU being 450 million people, that they would wean themselves off in just 5 years of that, finding alternate routes, finding alternate technologies and expanding them is quite difficult. For example, solar is a major renewable energy, but there are only two countries with significant solar exposure. One is Spain, which is a sunny country. The other is Germany. Germany is not a sunny country, but they invested so much in subsidies going back 2 decades. But not all countries in Europe are sunny. Just as an example, that they won't be able to draw upon these renewable things. And to then find alternate routes depends on what they're taking in terms of oil and natural gas from the other sources around the world. But not all producing, let's say, non-renewable producing countries also have have a good image in the European eyes. So it really might be a question of picking what from where and at what price, which involves a lot of disruption. So that's why it's not clear that they might be able to do it.
On the one hand, we've got more and more countries willing to join the NATO alliance that includes Finland and Sweden that have officially put on their candidacy for joining NATO. On the other hand, we have European energy giants that continue to buy Russian gas, as the EU guidelines kind of allow them to do so without breaching sanctions. Is this, I mean, there is a certain dichotomy in the, because NATO is the main factor due to which Russia started this conflict, because it did not want Ukraine to be a member of the NATO alliance. This NATO going eastwards at the same time, EU nations continuing to buy gas from Russia. Where is all of this going? I mean, I don't understand. On the one hand, you try to put sanctions. On the other hand, you continue to buy Russian gas. There is a need. I understand that, and you've just explained that as well. But to which extent is the European Union, the West, or the NATO will allow other countries to kind of be flexible as far as buying from Russia is concerned?
You're absolutely right. You've basically pierced the veil of the rhetoric, which seems very one-sided. The rhetoric is very sympathetic towards one country, but the practice, the economic contracts, and all of those things are not so one-sided. It seems that many entities beneath the supranational, so let's go to corporations, individuals, and that are not so one-sided, and therefore you see what you call dichotomy, and let's say it's a cognitive dissonance because you're saying that this is a terrible thing, but you're still willing to do business. It seems like it's not quite clear-cut, and that's where oftentimes economic rationale may supersede political rhetoric, and that is why you have the same competing force writ large around the world, where you may make a moral case one way, but you're still doing business with those people. And that actually predates this conflict. It's been an observation about many conflicts that have happened since World War II, where you do business and yet you're saying that this is terrible. And if that is true, either you tone down the rhetoric or you walk the talk, I believe. So I recognize what you're trying to point out in terms of inconsistencies where individual agents can profit from things, but still they'll repeat the rhetoric, which seems to be very high and mighty. So I recognize what you're saying.
I would really like to sit down with you one day and understand this rhetoric and where this rhetoric is leading the West and the European Union towards under the current situation with the food and the energy crisis that is lingering over the West. Thank you so very much, Dr. Usman Chohan, political economist, to have joined us and to have talked to us about the repercussions and what is happening as far as politics or economy of the region is concerned. We are at the 84th day, on the 84th day of this crisis between Russia and Ukraine that is engulfing more and more regions as we speak. Also, EU's top diplomat Joseph Borrell says that if numbers and reports are true, the Russian army has suffered impressive losses, while at the same time Britain says Russia has lost a third of its forces in Ukraine, but Mariupol in Ukraine seems to fall as Ukraine declares an end to the steelworks operation. A lot of developments, a lot of different sites that are being taken. Only time will tell what the actual reality to the issue is, and that will come to light in the next couple of days.